Charleston, West Virginia, the 11th of August, 1995. The Capital City Grill was almost empty. A waitress stacked menus. While the last customers drifted toward the door, the neon sign outside buzzed faintly, painting soft red light across the counter where Catherine Ethan signed out for the night. She'd been smiling all evening, joking with the line cook about weekend plans, counting her tips with tired but contented eyes. It was her usual Friday routine: finish late, drive across town, meet Silas at the university library to study. Nothing unusual, nothing dangerous. She stepped outside, the air warm and quiet, the street half-lit. Her old blue Ford Tempo waited beneath a flickering lamp. She unlocked the door, paused for a heartbeat, as if listening to something distant, then started the engine. Music hummed low through worn speakers while she adjusted her mirror, checking lipstick and hair in the dim reflection. 10:37 p.m. The car rolled forward, tires whispering over asphalt, headlights stretching ahead into an almost empty road. She was expected at the library by 11. She never made it there. The city at night moved differently back then. Fewer lights, fewer cars, and no cell phones to keep someone company on a dark road. The hum of Catherine's engine filled the silence as she followed the curve of Kanawha Boulevard. To her right, the river reflected the occasional passing headlight, quiet, steady, familiar. A traffic light turned red near the bank intersection. She stopped, drumming her fingers against the steering wheel. Across the street, an ATM camera blinked. For a second, it caught the image of her Ford Tempo idling under the light. A soft breeze tugged at her hair as she glanced both ways, unaware that this small moment, a pause at an empty crossing, would become her final trace on record. The light turned green. She accelerated west. That was it. No witnesses, no other vehicles recalled. The road returned to silence. Hours later, Silas waited at the library, growing restless as each minute passed. Midnight came. The lights went out. Catherine never arrived. By morning, the unease had turned to panic. Calls went unanswered. Her car was nowhere. Her apartment, untouched. It was as if the night itself had chosen her, and then erased her completely. The first call went out just after 7 a.m. Silas's voice shaking as he told the Charleston police that Catherine hadn't come home. Within hours, her roommate Vivian confirmed the same thing. Bed untouched, purse missing, but her books and keys still on the kitchen counter. Detectives began by retracing her usual routes. Friends from the diner were questioned, co-workers were contacted, and the university campus was searched. No one had seen her since she waved goodbye outside the Capital City Grill. By evening, her parents, Eliza and Devin Ethan, drove in from Elkview. They walked into the station clutching a photo of their daughter, the one she'd taken for her student ID just 2 months earlier, smiling, bright-eyed, completely unaware of the storm that was coming. The police organized a quick search near the riverside and along the road she was last seen driving. Dozens of volunteers joined in, friends, classmates, even strangers who just wanted to help. They combed through brush, checked parking lots, and called her name into the dark. Nothing. Day turned to night, and Charleston began to hold its breath. The story spread through radio broadcasts and word of mouth, reaching coffee shops, gas stations, and church bulletin boards. Everyone had the same reaction: disbelief. Catherine wasn't the kind of person who vanished. That disbelief turned to dread when the weekend passed with no trace at all. By the third day, the flyers were everywhere. Bright paper on telephone poles, grocery store windows. The same photo of Catherine, smiling against a light blue background, looking out over a city that had failed to keep her safe. Detectives expanded the search to the outskirts: old coal roads, service trails, and abandoned lots. Reporters began circling the story. Words like abduction and foul play crept into headlines, but no one dared say them aloud. The last thing Charleston saw of Catherine Ethan was her car gliding through an empty intersection at 10:41 p.m. After that, silence. A silence that stretched for years. It was the kind that kept parents awake, neighbors uneasy, and young women double-checking their locks before bedtime. Because when someone disappears without a trace, it isn't just one person who's gone, it's everyone's sense of safety. If this happened in your city tonight, wouldn't you want to know how it ended? Subscribe now. Most people think it could never happen to them until it does. Don't be that person who wishes they'd stayed alert. Hit subscribe before the next story hits too close to home. And if you won't subscribe, tell us why in the comments. What's stopping you? Detective Miles Corbin, the young officer assigned to the case, would later say that the photo of Catherine never left his desk. 25 years later, neither did the question that started it all. What really happened that night on Kanawha Boulevard? Before her name was tied to a police case file, Catherine Ethan was simply known as the girl everyone liked. She grew up in a modest home in the Kanawha City neighborhood, the kind of place where neighbors waved across lawns and families left their doors unlocked on summer evenings. Catherine thrived there. She played softball in high school, tutored younger students for free, and volunteered at a youth literacy program on weekends. At 21, she was in her final year at the University of Charleston, majoring in education. Her dream was to teach third grade. Kids listen better when you believe in them, she told her roommate once, and she meant it. Catherine carried herself with quiet confidence. Her laugh carried across rooms, the sort that made people turn and smile without realizing it. She had a way of making others feel seen, whether she was taking orders at the diner or studying in a crowded campus library. Her mother used to say she had old eyes, not tired, but knowing, the kind that could read a room faster than anyone else. Her father joked that she'd run a classroom like a courtroom one day, fair but firm. Everything about Catherine pointed forward a future that looked bright and unbreakable, until one ordinary night changed it all. Charleston, in the mid-90 seconds, carried an easy rhythm. College students filled downtown cafes, church bells marked the passing hours, and weekend fairs brought families to the riverfront. It wasn't glamorous, but it was safe, or at least it felt that way. Catherine fit into that rhythm effortlessly. She worked part-time as a hostess at the Capital City Grill, where her energy turned regular customers into friends. The staff adored her. She remembered birthdays, covered shifts for coworkers, and brought brownies from her mother's kitchen every Friday night. Her roommate, Vivian Lowe, was her opposite in temperament, quiet, methodical, and often the grounding force to Catherine's spontaneity. They shared a small off-campus apartment filled with second-hand furniture and Polaroids taped to the fridge. To them, it wasn't clutter. It was proof that their lives were moving somewhere. Her boyfriend, Silas Vance, a geology student from Beckley, matched her in ambition. They'd met in a general science course and were inseparable ever since two young people certain they had time to figure everything out. On weekends, Catherine drove home to see her parents. She'd help her mother tend the garden and listen to her father talk about old mining days. She was the kind of daughter who still left handwritten notes on the counter before heading back to campus. In a world that sometimes celebrated noise and drama, Catherine was steady light, bright enough to be noticed, calm enough to be trusted. By late summer of 1995, Catherine's life moved on rails, steady, predictable, and comforting. She worked the same shifts every week, walked the same route home, and drove the same two-lane road to campus. Routine kept her grounded. Everyone who knew her said the same thing. Catherine never took unnecessary risks. After classes, she'd often stop by a small bookstore near the boulevard, where the owner, Mrs. Crenshaw, kept a shelf of teaching manuals aside just for her. Catherine's face would light up when she found a new title. She was planning her student teaching semester and kept notes on lesson ideas, sketched classroom setups in her journal, and even practiced her handwriting to make it teacher neat. At night, she'd unwind at the Capital City Grill, where she could earn a little money and still feel part of the town's heartbeat. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid her tuition and gave her purpose. Customers often lingered at the counter just to talk. She had that rare ability to make strangers feel like friends. Her life looked simple, honest, and safe. But safety can be deceiving when it becomes routine. That Friday, August 11, began exactly like the hundreds before it. Catherine clocked in at 4 p.m., smiled through the dinner rush, and promised Silas she'd meet him at the library later to study. By 10:30 p.m., her apron was folded, her tips counted, and her car keys in hand. She was ready to head home. As her shift wound down, Catherine thanked the cook, wiped her hands on a towel, and said her usual goodbye, "See you Monday." She didn't rush. She never did. For her, small moments mattered: refilling a coffee cup, asking about a customer's family, holding a door open for a stranger. At 10:37 p.m., she stepped into the parking lot. The air was still warm from the day, carrying the faint scent of frying oil and summer pavement. She unlocked her car, tossed her purse onto the passenger seat, and started the engine. Music drifted softly from the radio, something upbeat, forgettable, but enough to fill the quiet. The drive ahead wasn't long. She knew every bend of the road, every storefront, every crossing light. A 10-minute stretch that should have ended in a familiar parking lot at the university library. Instead, it marked the beginning of a story that would haunt Charleston for decades. Some would later say they passed her car that night. Others swore they saw her headlights near the river. None of it ever led anywhere. The girl who once made everyone feel safe had vanished along the very roads she trusted most. Have you ever trusted a routine night that turned into a nightmare? When dawn crept over Charleston, Vivian Lowe knew something was wrong. Catherine's bed was still made, the room untouched, and her shoes neatly lined by the door just as she'd left them before work. But her purse was missing. Her car wasn't in the lot, and there was no note. Catherine always left notes. Vivian called the diner first. No one had seen her since she clocked out. She called Silas next. He answered on the first ring, sounding half awake but immediately alarmed. He'd waited at the library the night before, thinking maybe she'd changed plans, maybe she was tired, maybe. But as the hours passed, maybe stopped making sense. By 9 a.m., Silas was driving every road between the diner and the university, checking parking lots, gas stations, and bus stops. He replayed every conversation they'd had that week, looking for anything that might explain why she'd never arrived. Back at the apartment, Vivian stared at Catherine's planner lying open on the table. Every line of it was filled appointments, shifts, and reminders, except for the one date that now meant everything, the 11th of August, 1995. Next to it, Catherine had drawn a small heart. Vivian picked up the phone again, her hand trembling. It was time to call the police. The missing person report was filed before noon. At first, the responding officers treated it like a case of delay, a misunderstanding, a car trouble scenario that would resolve with a phone call. Charleston wasn't known for disappearances, and Catherine didn't fit the image of someone who would just walk away. Silas and Vivian spent the rest of the day retracing her usual routes. They checked the side streets near the boulevard, stopped by her favorite bookstore, and even drove past the diner twice. No car, no sign. Just the uneasy quiet of a city going about its routine while their world tilted sideways. By early evening, word had spread through campus. Friends gathered at the student center, writing down every place Catherine might have gone. A few students joined Silas in searching parking lots and roadside pull-offs. That night, local news gave a short mention: university student missing after late shift. It wasn't a headline yet, just a passing segment between sports scores and weather updates, but it was enough. People began to notice the name. Catherine Ethan. The girl who smiled at the diner. The one always studying at the library. Within 24 hours, her face was on the bulletin board at the police precinct, not as a suspect or a witness, but as a question no one could yet answer. By the second day, the Charleston Police Department had expanded their involvement. Patrol units canvassed routes stretching from Kanawha Boulevard to the Cabin Creek area. Flyers were distributed to gas stations and diners across the county. That's when Detective Miles Corbin entered the picture, 31 years old, recently transferred from traffic enforcement and known for his persistence. While others expected a quick resolution, he read through the initial reports twice. Something about the timing, the absence of any sign of struggle, didn't fit the usual narrative. He started small, verifying Catherine's last known movements. Co-workers confirmed she'd left the Capital City Grill around 10:30 p.m. Cameras from nearby shops were checked, but only one provided a lead. A grainy ATM video of her blue Ford Tempo driving west. After that, nothing. Corbin met with Silas and Vivian personally. Both were cooperative, both distraught. Silas's alibi, studying in the university library basement, was supported by 4 students who remembered him being there until past midnight. To Corbin, that ruled out impulse or accident. This wasn't someone who got lost. This was someone who'd been taken or stopped between the diner and the university. He ordered a broader search. Every road, every ditch, every field. No one knew it yet, but that decision would mark the start of a 25-year pursuit for answers. By the 3rd night, the Ethan family's home was filled with unanswered questions and the constant ring of a phone that never brought good news. Neighbors brought food, but no one was hungry. The television stayed on in the background, replaying Catherine's smiling face under a headline that now read, "Missing for 72 hours." Silas hadn't slept. He drove until dawn, parking along the boulevard just to stare at the road she should have taken. Vivian stayed with Catherine's parents, sorting through her friends' belongings for anything that might help police: receipts, notes, half-finished letters. Every object felt heavier now. Detective Corbin's search teams combed nearby woods, riverbanks, and abandoned service roads. Each night they returned empty-handed, their flashlights cutting through fog, but never revealing what everyone was desperate to find. The air in Charleston shifted. Parents double-checked curfews. Waitresses asked for rides home instead of walking. A quiet fear settled in, not spoken, but understood. Catherine Ethan was no longer just a name on a flyer. She had become a reminder that safety could vanish overnight. Comment below. What's the first thing you'd do if someone close vanished overnight? 3 days after Catherine Ethan vanished, a call came in from a pair of hikers exploring the Cabin Creek region, a dense stretch of woodland east of Charleston, known for its old coal roads and narrow trails. They'd spotted a blue car at the bottom of a slope, half hidden by overgrowth. Detective Corbin arrived just after sunrise, the air thick with humidity and the sound of cicadas. The vehicle was easy to identify even from a distance, a blue Ford Tempo, the same model registered to Catherine. He signaled to the officers to hold back until photographs were taken. The car sat at an odd angle, nose slightly downward, resting against a tangle of vines. There was no visible damage, no broken glass, no sign of a crash. It looked as though someone had simply parked it there and walked away. A tow truck operator muttered under his breath as he prepared the cables. "Doesn't make sense," he said quietly. "How'd it get down here without leaving tracks?" Corbin didn't answer. He was too busy studying the details, the locked doors, the clean exterior, the absence of any footprints in the mud. It was the first solid lead in 72 hours, but something about the scene felt wrong. Cars don't hide themselves. When the Ford Tempo was lifted from the embankment and set level on the roadside, the strangeness of the scene became undeniable. The doors were locked, the tires intact, the windows rolled up. Not a single dent or scrape along the frame. It looked recently washed, though the surrounding area was coated in dirt and fallen leaves. Officers broke the driver's window to gain access. The interior smelled faintly of cleaning solution, sharp enough to sting the nose. On the passenger seat lay a folded diner receipt with Catherine's name scribbled in blue ink, time-stamped the night she disappeared. In the back seat, an empty soda can and a stack of library index cards, untouched. Corbin leaned closer, scanning every inch of the dashboard, the floor mats, the upholstery. No fingerprints on the steering wheel, no hair strands, nothing under the seats except a few specks of gravel. Whoever had been in this car knew how to erase themselves. The glove compartment was empty, save for a single parking stub from the university lot dated a week earlier. No sign of a struggle, no personal items left behind. When the tow truck driver looked at Corbin and asked, "So, what do you think happened?" The detective didn't respond. He just stared through the windshield, his reflection staring back at him. Something wasn't adding up, not the location, not the state of the car, not the silence that surrounded it. As the car was processed back at the precinct garage, the team began its slow, methodical search. Corbin stood beside the evidence techs, watching them work panel by panel, seat by seat. They were down to the last corner of the interior when one of them paused. Wedged deep in the driver's seat cushion was a glint of metal, small, oval-shaped, almost invisible against the fabric. The technician eased it out with a pair of tweezers and placed it under the inspection light. It was a silver earring, ornate and slightly tarnished, with a single tiny stone set in the center. Catherine's family confirmed later that she'd never owned jewelry like it. Her mother was certain Catherine wore simple studs. Nothing fancy. Corbin studied the piece through a magnifier. It looked expensive, but old. The kind of item passed down rather than bought. A strange detail caught his attention, a fine scratch along the clasp, as if it had been pulled suddenly. The discovery was logged, photographed, and labeled Trace Evidence A. To anyone else, it was a small, forgettable object. To Corbin, it was a crack in a perfect wall. Someone else had been in that car close enough to drop something that didn't belong there. He ordered the earring to be tested for prints and fibers, but deep down, he already knew what the results would show. Whoever left it behind had taken every precaution to leave nothing else. When the lab report came back, it was exactly what Corbin expected. No fingerprints, no usable fibers, no traces of Catherine, except for a few strands of hair near the headrest. Whoever cleaned that car had done so with precision and patience. Corbin stood in the evidence bay long after everyone else had left. The silver earring sealed inside a small plastic envelope on the table before him. The soft hum of the fluorescent lights filled the silence. He thought about the distance between the diner and Cabin Creek, 20 miles of highway, service roads, and side routes. Too far for an accident, too neat for a panic-driven crime. He pinned a copy of Catherine's photo above the caseboard. Around it, he arranged every detail: the diner, the time, the ATM footage, the map of Kanawha Boulevard, and now, a photograph of the earring. A pattern was beginning to form, not chaos, but control. Whoever was responsible hadn't made a mistake. They'd chosen every step. Corbin wrote one note beneath the photograph: "Find the owner." He didn't know it then, but that single object, no bigger than a coin, would hold the truth for the next 25 years. He found one clue, but it didn't belong to her. Detective Corbin's team began their first round of interviews the week after Catherine's car was found. The station's small conference room became a revolving door of co-workers, classmates, and anyone who might have seen her that night. Tanya Mills, Catherine's closest friend at the diner, was first. She remembered Catherine clocking out at 10:30 p.m. Cheerful, carrying her worn brown purse and a folded receipt in her pocket. Tanya said Catherine mentioned stopping by the university to meet Silas before heading home, her usual plan. Nothing out of character. Then came the night manager, the dishwashers, and two regulars who had been at the diner that evening. Each gave the same timeline. Catherine left, alone, driving west. By the third day of questioning, Corbin began focusing on people whose accounts felt too tidy. One name rose early: Dorian Hayes, a maintenance worker at the diner. He was known around town for being quiet, sometimes withdrawn, and a bit too interested in the younger staff. He'd been seen talking to Catherine a few times, nothing overtly inappropriate, but enough to catch attention. When brought in for questioning, Hayes claimed he left the diner minutes before Catherine, heading home to care for his mother. His story checked out on paper, but something about his tone left Corbin uneasy, polite, defensive, and rehearsed. For every question answered, 3 more appeared. Catherine's world, once so ordinary, now seemed filled with faces hiding uncertainty. As days turned into weeks, Charleston's calm started to crack. Local radio hosts debated theories, newspapers ran speculative headlines, and neighbors began glancing twice at the people they'd known for years. The diner saw a drop in customers. Some said they couldn't eat there anymore. Others came only to gossip, hoping to hear a new rumor. Dorian Hayes's name floated from porch to porch, his reputation souring with every retelling. Corbin's phone rang constantly, new leads, false sightings, anonymous calls. Someone claimed they'd seen Catherine near a rest stop 2 counties over. Another insisted she'd been taken by a long-haul trucker passing through town. Each report was followed, each one empty. Vivian and Silas spent their days at the police station, answering the same questions again and again. Silas grew defensive, tired of the unspoken suspicion that clung to him. "You think I did this?" he asked Corbin once, his voice cracking from exhaustion. Corbin didn't answer right away. He couldn't rule anyone out, not yet. Meanwhile, the media began portraying Catherine as both angel and mystery. Every story used the same photograph, the same hopeful caption, but behind the optimism, the tone was changing. The city wanted a villain, someone to blame, and Corbin, still chasing a single silver earring, had nothing concrete to give them. The silence was starting to speak louder than the evidence. While the community fixated on Dorian Hayes, Corbin kept revisiting the early witness list names that had been logged but quickly dismissed. One stood out, not because of suspicion, but because of reputation: Elias Denton. At the time, Denton was a well-known civics teacher at a local high school and a deacon at a downtown church. He'd been present at a town meeting the night Catherine disappeared, just a few blocks from the diner. His brief interview was unremarkable. He'd expressed sympathy, mentioned seeing a blue car driving west, and provided an alibi supported by several respected city officials who attended the same meeting. Corbin's notes from that interview were short, almost routine. There was nothing outwardly odd about the man. In fact, he seemed the picture of reliability, steady job, long marriage, decades of community service. But something about the entry lingered. Denton's mention of seeing a car near the boulevard came unprompted. He'd volunteered that detail before being asked. Small, perhaps meaningless, but Corbin had learned that the smallest details were often the most revealing. Still, with no evidence linking Denton or anyone else to Catherine's disappearance, the investigation turned back to the suspects who fit easier narratives: the co-worker, the stranger, the unknown predator. Elias Denton's name was filed away, a footnote on page 6 of a report no one expected to read again. By the end of autumn, the investigation had stalled. Search teams had covered more than 30 miles of terrain, divers had scanned sections of the Kanawha River, and every tip called into the hotline had been checked, logged, and discarded. Nothing pointed anywhere. The diner reopened its regular hours. Reporters drifted on to other stories. Even the reward fund, once a hopeful gesture, began to fade from public memory. The posters of Catherine that lined the telephone poles turned from bright white to pale gray under the weather. Detective Corbin's office told a different story. His board remained covered in maps, photographs, and handwritten notes threads connecting timestamps, names, and roads. Yet every line circled back to the same emptiness. The Ethan family continued holding weekly vigils by the river, candles flickering in silence. Silas often stood apart from the crowd, shoulders slumped, eyes fixed on the water. Vivian stopped speaking to the media altogether. She said there was nothing left to say until something new was found. Winter crept in, and the city adjusted to the absence the way people adjust to a scar it stayed visible. But life moved around it. The case of Catherine Ethan was never closed, only labeled inactive, pending new evidence. Who would you have suspected? Tell us in the comments, you might be surprised. Years turned into decades, yet Catherine's name never left Charleston. It lived on in news clippings folded into drawers, in fading posters still taped to utility poles, and in the memory of those who had watched the searchlights sweep the hills that first week in 1995. Detective Miles Corbin didn't transfer, didn't retire, and didn't stop reviewing the case. He moved through promotions, earning a captain's badge, but Catherine's file stayed on his desk through every office change. Other detectives called it his ghost case. Corbin never corrected them. Each anniversary drew the same pattern: a brief article, a photo of Catherine smiling, a quote from her parents, and then silence until the next year. The rhythm became familiar, like a sad tradition the city couldn't escape. For some, the case had become part of local folklore. Parents told the story as a warning to their daughters: don't drive alone, don't take shortcuts, don't trust the quiet parts of the road. Yet behind those warnings lingered an unease that no one voiced. The killer was still out there, perhaps living among them. Every few years, Corbin would reopen the evidence boxes, hoping new technology or a fresh perspective might yield something the original investigation missed. But each time, the results were the same. The Ford Tempo, the earring, the same unanswered questions. Time hadn't softened the mystery, it had simply made it colder. For Eliza and Devin Ethan, life was split into two timelines: before Catherine vanished, and after. Every morning began with the same ritual. Eliza brewed coffee, folded the newspaper, and checked the local section first, scanning for any mention of new findings, new technology, new hope. Most mornings, there was nothing. They never moved away from Kanawha City. The house remained exactly as it was in 1995, Catherine's bedroom preserved down to the smallest detail. Her framed school photographs lined the hallway, her handwriting still visible on sticky notes beside the mirror. Each August, on the anniversary of her disappearance, they held a vigil by the river. Dozens came at first: classmates, teachers, neighbors. Over time, the crowds grew smaller, but the candles never stopped burning. Eliza once said during a news interview, "The world keeps moving, but we can't." We're stuck on that night, waiting for someone to tell us why. Devin's grief was quieter, but constant. He spent his weekends driving old routes marked on maps from the investigation, as though he could still find something everyone else had missed. The Ethans turned their sorrow into action. They pushed for a statewide cold case task force, raised funds for victim advocacy, and kept Catherine's story alive in any way they could. For most families, 25 years would have been enough to give up. For the Ethans, it only meant 25 years closer to the truth. By the time Captain Miles Corbin entered his 50s, most of his colleagues viewed the Ethan case as an unsolved tragedy best left in the past. Corbin couldn't. Every time he walked into his office, Catherine's faded photo stared back from the board beside his desk, smiling, untouched by time, while everything around it aged. He'd built his reputation on persistence, but this case had taken something from him that no promotion could replace. The investigation had followed him through 2 decades, 3 police chiefs, and countless other assignments. He still visited the evidence vault twice a year to check on the labeled boxes: vehicle, photographs, witness statements, trace evidence A. Younger officers asked him why he kept revisiting the same files. He would answer the same way every time: because someone still remembers what happened, and one day they'll slip. Late nights became routine. Corbin reviewed old statements under a desk lamp, listening to cassette recordings of witness interviews from 1995. Some tapes had hissed with age, but he could still recognize every voice. He noticed details others had dismissed: inconsistent wording, pauses, and moments where people sounded too careful. He began rereading transcripts line by line, focusing on the smallest patterns. To others, it looked like obsession. To Corbin, it was unfinished work. The difference between obsession and duty, he believed, was whether or not you still cared about the outcome. And Corbin cared. He always would. Charleston never truly let go of the story. Every few years, it resurfaced a newspaper anniversary feature, a short segment on the evening news, or a true crime discussion at a local library. People would shake their heads, tell newcomers about the girl who disappeared, and then return to their daily routines. Yet behind that surface calm, the case lived on like an old wound that refused to close. Students at the University of Charleston still mentioned Catherine's name during campus safety meetings. Some said they felt her presence near the boulevard at night, an echo of headlights that never reached their destination. Whether those stories were superstition or sympathy didn't matter. They kept her memory alive. By now, the faces had changed. New families, new businesses, new officers. But for the older residents, the name Catherine Ethan carried weight. She represented the moment Charleston's innocence slipped away. Captain Corbin kept the case file open on his computer, even when no one else was looking. He knew what most people had quietly accepted. Time doesn't erase what it hasn't resolved. Some nights, as the city slept, he'd glance again at the photo tacked above his desk and whisper a promise to the girl who still waited for an ending. Have you ever felt justice was moving too slow or not at all? By 2020, Elias Denton was more than just a familiar face in Charleston. He was part of its foundation. For 25 years, he had taught high school civics, guided dozens of students into college, and spoken at church gatherings about honesty, family, and faith. When he walked through town, people greeted him by name, parents trusted him, colleagues admired him. He lived in a brick house near the edge of town, with a small garden his wife tended, and a porch swing that never stopped moving. Every Sunday, he wore the same navy suit to service, shaking hands, offering warm smiles, leading youth programs. In a city that had carried its share of loss, Elias Denton represented the opposite of fierce stability, the kind of man people leaned on when tragedy struck. No one ever questioned where he'd been that night in 1995, because why would they? He'd spoken kindly of Catherine when her disappearance was mentioned. He'd attended one of the early vigils. His name appeared in the first set of reports, yes, but without a trace of suspicion. To the city, he was the last person anyone would associate with violence. But to fate, and to the detective who never stopped looking, he was about to become the center of everything. Elias Denton's name carried weight in Charleston. He had taught long enough for generations of families to pass through his classroom. Parents spoke fondly of him. Their children called him Mr. Denton, even years after graduation. His lessons on ethics and civic duty were often quoted at town events. His voice calm, deliberate, reassuring. At school, he was known for staying late, grading papers while the janitor swept the halls. His door was always open for students who needed guidance. He brought snacks to staff meetings, volunteered at food drives, and was the first to donate whenever the community rallied around someone in need. The local paper had once called him the conscience of Charleston, a phrase he pretended to dislike but never corrected. To his colleagues, he was humble. To his neighbors, reliable. To his church, devoted. Even Detective Corbin had attended one of his civic lectures years earlier, sitting quietly at the back of a conference room. Denton had spoken about the moral duty of citizens to uphold truth and accountability. His delivery was steady, confident, the kind of man who seemed incapable of deceit. It was the kind of reputation built not through charm, but consistency, the kind that disarms suspicion before it's even formed. But reputations, Corbin had learned, can be the best disguises of all. The first flicker of doubt didn't come from police reports, it came from memory. During a review of old case notes, Corbin noticed something he'd missed years ago. Denton had volunteered information in his original statement that was never public. He'd described Catherine's car in precise detail, not just the color, but the year and trim, details that only someone who'd stood close to the vehicle would know. Corbin went back to the original tape. Denton's tone was calm, confident, even friendly. Too comfortable. Most witnesses stumbled, struggled to recall. he never did. When Corbin requested a background update, Denton's life appeared spotless, no arrests, no complaints, no financial trouble. His record looked cleaner than most officers' files. Yet, as Corbin stared at the screen, he couldn't shake the feeling that perfection itself was the camouflage. He drove home that night thinking of the families who'd trusted Denton with their children, the community that had turned to him for comfort after Catherine's disappearance. The idea formed slowly, like a weight pressing on his chest. What if the man everyone trusted most was the one they should have feared all along? He was the kind of man everyone trusted, and that's exactly why no one saw it coming. If you think evil always looks dangerous, think again. Subscribe so you're never blindsided by what's hiding in plain sight. Still not sure? Then tell us in the comments why you'd rather stay unprepared. 2 weeks after rediscovering Denton's original statement, Corbin reopened the case file for the first time in nearly a decade. The boxes were worn from years of storage, their edges softened, labels fading. He laid everything out across the table, photographs, transcripts. The evidence envelope marked Trace Evidence A. The silver earring glinted under the desk lamp. Corbin hadn't looked at it this closely in years. The lab report attached to it still read, "No match found." But DNA analysis had evolved since then. What once seemed final now looked unfinished. He requested a retest quietly, without alerting anyone else in the department. Something about Denton's tone, his precision, his place in the community felt off. Corbin had spent too many years trusting instinct to ignore it now. The request was approved. The earring was sealed in a courier box and shipped to a federal lab, specializing in cold case genealogy testing. It was a long shot, maybe even a waste of resources in some officers' eyes. But for Corbin, it was a chance, one last attempt to honor a promise he'd made to a photograph on his wall. The truth was coming. And it was closer than anyone wanted to believe. Is it possible for a pillar of the community to live a double life? What do you think? By 2020, Charleston's cold case unit had changed hands 3 times. Most of its files gathered dust, but a new wave of federal funding arrived that year, part of a nationwide initiative to apply modern DNA genealogy to unresolved cases. Captain Miles Corbin sat through the presentation half listening until a slide appeared showing how decades-old samples had led to recent arrests across the country. When the speaker mentioned a recovered hair strand solving a 1987 homicide, Corbin felt his pulse quicken. That night, he reopened the Ethan file once again. He spread the photos across his desk, the car, the earring, the map. The words, "Trace Evidence A," seemed to stare back at him. The last lab report had declared it inconclusive. But now, with genetic genealogy, that limitation no longer applied. Corbin filed a formal request to include the Ethan case in the federal pilot program. It took weeks for approval, followed by days of sorting through archived materials to locate the original sealed evidence. When the courier finally collected the package, Corbin stood by as it was logged and signed out. He told the lab technician, "This one's been waiting 25 years for the right kind of science." That night, he sat alone in his office, staring at the photo of Catherine on the wall. He whispered the same promise he'd repeated for years, "We're not done yet." For the first time in decades, he meant it. The evidence box arrived from storage wrapped in brown paper, sealed with multiple layers of tape and signatures from each officer who had handled it over the years. The handwriting on the oldest tags had faded into near illegibility. Corbin lifted the lid carefully, as though time itself might collapse if he moved too fast. Inside were plastic sleeves marked by date and category, photographs, reports, and one small envelope labeled Trace Evidence A. The earring was exactly as he remembered, still silver, still intact, still holding the weight of unanswered questions. It had been handled so many times during the original investigation that Corbin half expected it to crumble. Instead, it gleamed faintly under the fluorescent light, untouched by the decades. A new technician from the state lab arrived that morning to prepare the material for shipment. She wore double gloves, logging every step in silence. Corbin stood nearby, watching as she placed the evidence into a sterile container. He signed the final transfer sheet and looked at the clock. For a moment, the station felt frozen. The hum of computers, the steady ticking, the low murmur of voices down the hall. 25 years of waiting, compressed into one sealed vial. As the courier truck pulled away, Corbin exhaled for the first time that day. He didn't know what would come back from the lab, but he felt something shift. It wasn't hope exactly, it was readiness. In a laboratory 3 states away, technicians worked quietly through the night. For them, the Ethan case was one of dozens in the queue, another sealed envelope marked with dates from a decade-long past. But as the sample was extracted and processed, something unexpected appeared. The DNA recovered from the earring wasn't a full profile, but it was enough. The new sequencing system allowed partial strands to be cross-referenced against public genealogy databases, the kind used for family history research. The process took weeks, running comparisons through thousands of possible relatives. When the first matches began to form, the data narrowed down to a cluster of families in Kanawha County, all sharing distant genetic links. The program built a branching map, names, dates, lineages, until one surname kept reappearing at key intersections. Denton. It wasn't an exact hit, but statistically, it was close enough to warrant further testing. The lead technician prepared a report and forwarded it to Charleston PD. The message was short and technical. DNA pattern consistent with relatives of Elias Denton. Recommend confirmation testing. When the email landed in Corbin's inbox, he read it 3 times before speaking. 25 years after Catherine Ethan vanished, the first piece of proof had surfaced not from witnesses, not from confession, but from bloodlines silently holding secrets through generations. Corbin closed the report and whispered to himself, "We've got something." For the first time, the story was no longer just tragedy, it was about to become truth. The follow-up testing took less than 2 weeks. Corbin spent those days restless, unable to focus on anything else, replaying every moment from the original investigation. When the lab's call finally came, it was short and direct. The secondary sample confirms it. The DNA from the earring matches a direct relative of Elias Denton. Corbin froze. For a long moment, he said nothing. The phone stayed against his ear as his mind scrambled to catch up. Elias Denton, the teacher, the deacon, the man everyone trusted, his genetic signature was now tied to Catherine Ethan's missing night. He thanked the analyst, hung up, and sat alone in his office. The evidence board stared back at him like an old adversary, finally breaking its silence. He opened the original report from 1995, reading the name Elias Denton at the top of the witness list, a name he'd once skimmed past without a second thought. For 25 years, that man had attended vigils, comforted grieving parents, and stood under the same church roof as the detective searching for him. Corbin whispered quietly. All this time, outside, the city carried on as usual, unaware that the truth was finally emerging from the quiet corners of science. This was no longer theory, it was proof. Science caught what lies can't hide. Subscribe before the next breakthrough changes everything. Once the DNA link to Elias Denton appeared, Corbin knew he couldn't rely on past reports or assumptions. He needed something irrefutable, a living sample. A small team from the Charleston Police Department set up discreet surveillance near Denton's home. They worked from unmarked cars, parked on alternating streets, keeping shifts long but unpredictable. No uniforms, no marked vehicles, no visible presence. Denton's life appeared ordinary. He left home every morning at the same time, drove the same route to school, and returned by late afternoon. He visited the same grocery store every Thursday, mowed his lawn on weekends, and waved to his neighbors. Corbin watched him through binoculars one evening and felt a mix of disbelief and anger. This was the man who had shaken hands with grieving parents, spoken at school assemblies about morality, and led prayers for a girl he'd likely taken from the world himself. Yet even now, there was nothing outwardly suspicious, no nervous habits, no sign of fear. Corbin briefed his team nightly. The order was clear. No confrontation, no mistakes. They needed an uncontaminated DNA sample, something discarded voluntarily. Every day they waited felt heavier than the last. The city outside kept moving, unaware that history was quietly being rewritten on a quiet Charleston street. It was only a matter of time. The first week passed without progress. Denton's movements remained painfully predictable, and that predictability gnawed at Corbin. Every coffee stop, every grocery visit, every Sunday service ended the same way. Nothing left behind, nothing to collect. Surveillance shifts rotated between officers, but Corbin refused to step away. He sat for hours in the parked sedan, notebook on his lap, jotting times and routes with the precision of habit. Each entry felt heavier than the last. It wasn't just about catching a suspect anymore. It was about keeping a promise. Catherine's parents had aged. Her father's hair had turned white. Her mother's voice trembled during interviews. Corbin knew time had already taken too much from them. He couldn't let it take justice too. One night, an officer leaned back in his seat and muttered, "What if he never slips?" Corbin didn't answer. He stared through the windshield and whispered, "Everyone slips. The difference is when." That became the unspoken mantra of the operation. The weather shifted from rain to frost, and with each passing morning, their patience thinned. Denton remained composed, calm, never breaking routine. But Corbin knew the more perfect the pattern, the more fragile it becomes. All it would take was one moment of carelessness. One small, everyday mistake. And when that moment came, Corbin intended to be watching. It happened on a Thursday morning. Denton stopped at a small diner on the corner of Washington Street, the same place he'd visited countless times before work. He ordered his usual black coffee and a muffin, chatting with the cashier as though the world hadn't been watching him for weeks. Corbin sat across the street in an unmarked car, eyes fixed on the window. Denton drank his coffee slowly, reading a newspaper, every movement precise and unhurried. When he finished, he stood, folded the paper neatly, and walked toward the exit. Outside, he paused at the trash can, dropped the empty styrofoam cup inside, and continued down the sidewalk. Corbin didn't breathe. He waited until Denton turned the corner, then signaled to his partner. Within seconds, an officer retrieved the cup with gloved hands, sealed it in a sterile evidence bag, and labeled it for immediate transport. There was no celebration, no words exchanged, just the sound of a car door closing and the quiet hum of the engine as they drove back to headquarters. Corbin placed the bag on his desk, staring at the faint lip mark along the rim, that single trace of skin cells, invisible to the eye, now carried the potential to end a mystery that had haunted half a lifetime. He sent the sample to the lab under urgent priority. But this time, the waiting felt different. It felt like the beginning of the end. The results arrived 3 days later. The message was short: DNA from submitted sample matches genetic material from trace evidence A, 100% confirmation. Corbin read it twice, his hands steady, his breath shallow. For a long time, he didn't speak. 25 years of chasing shadows had ended with a disposable coffee cup. He walked into the evidence room and stood before Catherine's photograph. It had hung there so long it had yellowed around the edges. He whispered quietly, "We got him." There was no applause, no announcement. Just silence, the kind that follows when truth finally fills a space where doubt once lived. Outside, Charleston moved on like it always had. People went to work, students crossed the boulevard, and life continued. None of them knew that justice had just shifted quietly into motion. Corbin felt the exhaustion of every year collapse into that single moment, not relief, just release. He thought of Catherine's parents, of the nights spent staring at empty roads, of every dead end that had led here. This wasn't luck. It wasn't even technology alone. It was time, patience, and the refusal to let a promise fade. It wasn't technology alone, it was persistence. Would you have kept fighting that long? It was just after 6 a.m., when unmarked vehicles rolled quietly through the tree-lined streets of Charleston's East End. The neighborhood was still half asleep, porch lights glowed faintly, newspapers sat untouched on doorsteps, and the air carried that stillness that precedes routine. Detective Corbin sat in the lead car, eyes fixed on the house ahead. A 2-story brick home with white shutters and a flag by the door, the same house he'd driven past for months without knocking. Inside, Elias Denton was making coffee. His wife had already left for an early hospital shift. At 6:12, Corbin gave the signal. Officers approached in coordinated silence. The knock came first, sharp, official, unhurried. Then came the call. "Police, we have a warrant." Denton opened the door in a pressed shirt, confusion etched across his face. The shock was brief. His composure returned almost instantly. He didn't resist. He simply looked at Corbin and said, "There's been some mistake." Corbin didn't respond. He read the rights aloud, each word measured and deliberate. Denton's hands trembled slightly as the cuffs clicked into place. Neighbors peeked through curtains. A few stepped onto porches, whispering. The man they'd trusted with their children's lessons, their prayers, their community projects, was being led into a squad car. No one spoke. No one needed to. By mid-morning, the story had already broken. News vans crowded outside Charleston Police Headquarters, reporters jostling for position beneath a hastily assembled podium. The department's seal glimmered under camera lights as microphones were fixed in place. Captain Miles Corbin stepped forward, his voice steady but lower than usual. Years of silence had led to this single announcement, and every word carried the weight of that journey. "This morning," he began, "Elias Denton, age 64, was taken into custody in connection with the disappearance and death of Catherine Ethan." The crowd gasped, not at the name of the victim, but at the suspect. Denton's face had been on the cover of community newsletters, charity events, and graduation ceremonies. Now it appeared in a booking photo projected on the screen behind Corbin. Reporters shouted questions. How was he caught? What evidence led to this? How long had he been under investigation? Corbin kept his tone even. Through advances in forensic genealogy, DNA evidence recovered in 1995 has now been conclusively linked to Mr. Denton. This arrest represents decades of persistence, science, and dedication to justice. He paused before continuing. For 25 years, this city carried a wound. Today, we begin to close it. The statement ended. Cameras continued to flash, capturing the moment Charleston realized the truth had been living quietly among them, not hiding in shadows, but standing behind a teacher's desk. For many, the shock was just beginning. Charleston changed overnight. The same neighborhoods that once praised Elias Denton now whispered his name with disbelief. Parents who had trusted him to guide their children sat frozen at kitchen tables, staring at the news broadcasts that played his face between headlines about betrayal and justice. At St. Mark's Church, where Denton had served for 2 decades, the morning service turned somber. The pastor stood at the pulpit, his hands trembling as he spoke. "We pray for the Ethan family, and we pray for truth, even when truth hurts." Some couldn't accept it. "Not Mr. Denton," one parent said, shaking her head outside the school gates. "He was kind. He helped my son get a scholarship." Others reacted with anger. "He stood there every year lighting candles for Catherine," another man said. "How do you do that if you're the one who took her?" Silas watched the coverage from his apartment in silence, jaw clenched. Vivian, now living out of state, refused interviews. The Ethan family, when reached for comment, released only one line through their attorney: "We thank those who never stopped searching." That night, candlelight once again flickered along Kanawha Boulevard, not for hope this time, but for reckoning. The city that had long feared the unknown now faced something worse, the truth it already knew, but never wanted to see. And in the middle of that silence stood one undeniable question: how long had evil worn the face of trust? When the adrenaline of the arrest faded, Charleston was left with silence. Reporters moved on to new angles, but for those who had known Elias Denton personally, disbelief lingered like smoke that refused to clear. Captain Corbin sat alone in his office, the glow of the city fading through the blinds. He had waited half his life for justice, yet the moment didn't feel triumphant. He opened the old case file one last time: Catherine's photograph, the diner receipt, the silver earring, all pieces that had refused to rest until now. He realized justice isn't loud. It doesn't always come with closure. Sometimes it arrives quietly, wrapped in grief for what might have been prevented. Across town, Catherine's parents held a small gathering at the riverbank. No speeches this time, no cameras, just the sound of water moving under the bridge as they placed flowers in the current. For Charleston, this wasn't just the end of a case, it was a reckoning with trust itself. He was the teacher everyone trusted. Evil often hides in plain sight. Subscribe to stay aware. If someone like him could walk free for 25 years, imagine what else is still out there. Don't look away. Subscribe so you're not the last to know when truth finally surfaces. And if you still refuse, tell us why below. We're listening. The trial began in early spring. The courthouse steps overflowed with reporters, camera crews, and townspeople who had lived with the story for half their lives. For weeks, Charleston's conversations circled around one question: not what happened, but how it could have been hidden for so long. Inside, the courtroom carried an uneasy calm. Elias Denton sat beside his attorney, dressed neatly in a gray suit, hands folded. He looked older, thinner, but his expression remained measured. No outburst, no apology, just silence. Corbin watched from the gallery, his badge tucked away. This was no longer his battle to fight. His role was done. But he couldn't stay home. After 25 years, he needed to see the truth spoken out loud. The prosecution began by recounting Catherine Ethan's last known movements: the diner, the car, the earring. The jury listened intently as photos were displayed, the same ones Corbin had pinned to his board for decades. When the lab results were presented, the courtroom fell quiet. The DNA match, the timeline, the forensic link, it all converged with clinical precision. For the first time, Charleston's most trusted man was being described not as a teacher or leader, but as a murderer. Some jurors looked away, others stared at Denton like they were seeing him for the first time. It was the unmasking of goodness, the realization that trust, once given, had been turned into a weapon. The prosecution's case unfolded like a slow burn. Exhibit after exhibit was introduced: the recovered Ford Tempo, the retested earring, and the confirmed DNA report that left no statistical room for doubt. When the forensic specialist took the stand, she explained the genealogy process in plain language, tracing the genetic threads that led back to Elias Denton's bloodline. Every sentence tightened the courtroom silence. But as the truth solidified, disbelief found its defenders. Several of Denton's former students filled the benches behind him, their faces pale with confusion. Some cried quietly, others shook their heads. One woman whispered, "He taught me about honesty." Even outside the courthouse, the city split in two. Some residents insisted on forgiveness. "He's old now, let him face God." Others demanded retribution. He lived free while she was buried in memory. For Corbin, sitting in the back row, it was neither anger nor pity that filled him, but exhaustion. He'd seen too many people mistake kindness for innocence. When Denton's defense finally spoke, they offered no denial, only interpretation. This evidence proves connection, not intent. But the calmness of their argument couldn't erase the 25 years of silence that followed Catherine's disappearance. The evidence didn't just reveal guilt. It revealed the fragility of certainty, how easily good reputations can hide the darkest truths. On the 7th day of the trial, the Ethan family was called to testify. Eliza Ethan took the stand first. Her voice trembled, but her words never faltered. She didn't speak about evidence or timelines. She spoke about Catherine's laugh, her kindness, the sound of her car pulling into the driveway that night for the last time. "I kept her room the same," she told the jury. "I thought maybe she'd walk back through that door, and I wanted her to see everything waiting." Her husband, Devon, followed. His testimony was shorter, but the weight behind it was crushing. "I don't hate him," he said, looking in Denton's direction, "but I hate what he took. He took the part of us that believed people like him couldn't exist." The courtroom sat in silence. Even Denton, for the first time, looked away. When Eliza stepped down, she paused by Corbin in the gallery. She didn't speak, she simply nodded. A quiet acknowledgement between two people who had carried the same ghost for decades. The prosecutor's closing question echoed through the room. "Do you believe justice after 25 years is still justice?" Eliza answered softly, "It's the only kind left." That sentence stayed with everyone who heard it, not as comfort, but as a reckoning. The verdict arrived on a gray afternoon. The jury deliberated less than 5 hours before returning to the courtroom. Guilty on all counts. The words rippled through the room, followed by a hush so complete it felt sacred. Elias Denton didn't flinch. He simply exhaled, eyes lowered, as though the world had finally caught up to him. The officer standing behind placed a hand on his shoulder before leading him out. No resistance, no final words, just quiet surrender. Captain Corbin remained seated, staring at the empty defense table. This was the ending he'd chased, but it didn't feel like victory. Justice had arrived, but it hadn't repaired anything. Catherine was still gone. The years were still gone. Outside, people gathered on the courthouse steps, some crying, some clapping, others simply standing in disbelief. The community's relief was tangled with confusion, as if no one could quite decide whether to mourn or breathe again. In that moment, Charleston wasn't celebrating justice. It was learning what it costs. That night, as the courthouse lights dimmed, Corbin walked past a mural of Catherine painted years earlier. Beneath her smiling face were the words, "Gone, but never forgotten." He paused, touched the edge of the wall, and whispered, "We remembered. Justice doesn't heal, it reveals. What would forgiveness look like to you?" The last morning, Captain Corbin walked into the Charleston Police Department. The hallways felt heavier than usual. His desk was almost bare, no more stacks of cold files, no half-drained coffee cups, no late-night notes written in frustration. Only one thing remained pinned to the evidence board, Catherine Ethan's photo. He stood in front of it for a long time, hands tucked in his pockets, remembering the promise he'd made to her parents decades earlier. "I won't stop until she's home." He had kept that promise, though the cost had been high. Colleagues stopped by to shake his hand. Some offered thanks. Others said nothing at all, aware that words felt too small for what the years had demanded of him. Before leaving, Corbin reached for the pushpin holding Catherine's photo. The small tear of paper as it came loose sounded final. He slipped the photo into an envelope, wrote her name one last time, and placed it gently in his jacket pocket. Outside, the air carried a cool bite of early autumn. He looked up at the skyline, the same city that had once been haunted by an unanswered question. Today, at least, the question had an answer. Corbin turned away from the building, his step steady but unhurried. He wasn't chasing justice anymore. He was finally walking toward peace. Charleston didn't forget what happened, it adjusted around it. The case had become part of its identity, woven into local history like an old scar that reminded everyone how fragile trust could be. The school where Elias Denton once taught reopened under new leadership. His name was quietly removed from the plaques in the hallway, replaced by a memorial for Catherine, Ethan, and other victims of unsolved cases across West Virginia. Students walked past the new inscription every morning, a subtle reminder that goodness isn't about appearances, but choices. Each spring, the city held a Light for the Lost event at the Riverside Park. Families brought candles, not just for Catherine, but for anyone still waiting for answers. It wasn't about tragedy anymore, it was about resilience. Local businesses donated to victim support programs. Teachers used Catherine's story to discuss empathy and accountability. Even law enforcement adapted, expanding its cold case division and partnering with genealogy labs nationwide. Some people still couldn't reconcile the truth. They preferred to remember the smiling teacher rather than the man revealed in court. Others accepted that two things could exist at once: kindness and cruelty, often in the same person. Through it all, Charleston learned something hard: but lasting safety isn't guaranteed by familiarity, and justice doesn't end when the gavel falls. It endures in memory, in change, and in vigilance. Months after the trial, Catherine's personal items were finally released from evidence storage. Among them was the single silver earring, the one that had waited 25 years to tell its story. Eliza Ethan received it in a small envelope, sealed with the department's insignia. She opened it slowly at her kitchen table, while her husband sat beside her in quiet support. The earring rested in her palm, lighter than she remembered, but it carried a lifetime's worth of weight. She didn't cry this time. She simply whispered, "You finally spoke." That earring had survived storms, transfers, and time itself. It had outlasted careers, outweighted lies, and held the truth long enough for science to uncover what people could not. When Captain Corbin heard that the Ethans had received it, he smiled faintly. He'd always believed that evidence had memory, that objects remember what people forget. The earring was displayed later that year at the new cold case memorial exhibit inside police headquarters. A small plaque beneath it read, "Truth has no expiration date." Visitors would stop and stare at the simple silver curve behind the glass, an ordinary piece of jewelry that changed the course of an entire town's history. For some, it was a reminder of how fragile safety feels. For others, it was proof that even after decades of silence, truth will always find a voice. In the months that followed, Captain Corbin settled into retirement quietly. No ceremonies, no speeches. He moved to a small home on the outskirts of the city where the nights were still and the phone rarely rang. But some habits never left him. Each morning, he read the newspaper front to back, circling stories about missing persons or reopened cases. Not because he wanted to go back, but because he still believed in the pursuit. Sometimes, he would drive past the diner where Catherine had worked. It had changed names and owners, but the windows still reflected the same stretch of boulevard. He'd park for a few minutes, let the past wash over him, and then continue on. Charleston, for all its history, had found its rhythm again, but it was a different rhythm, slower, wiser, more aware. Parents locked their doors earlier, neighbors checked in on each other, and when someone disappeared now, the city reacted faster, louder, united. In every community gathering, every candle-lit vigil, Catherine's name lived on not as tragedy, but as testament. Her story reminded them that evil doesn't always announce itself, and that truth, no matter how long it hides, never fades completely. As Corbin once said to a young detective, "Justice isn't about closing files, it's about keeping faith." Don't just watch, learn. Subscribe, so truth never hides from you again.